So, as we're talking about the different types of animals that we find on rangeland and the different digestive systems that they have, let us take this a step further and talk more specifically about ruminants. So, our ruminants can actually be further split or subcategorized into three different feeding types: concentrate selectors, over here to the left, intermediate selectors, and then our grass and our roughage selectors, which are over here to the right. So each type of species that we find on rangeland, all throughout the world, can be categorized into one of these feeding types. And these selection mechanisms for each individual species become very important because they are going to go out into a pasture or a piece of rangeland and actually select a plant type, or have more preference over one plant type versus another. So, knowing these differences in not only how their digestive system is going to process that vegetation, but also that they're going to select it and make a behavioral cognizant thought is really relates back to utilizing what our rangelands have to offer so that we don't overgraze one piece of rangeland because it doesn't have one type of plant on it. So if we look at these three different grazing types, or concentrates, intermediates, and roughages, some of the species that can be categorized into each one of these are goats. They're going to be more of our browsers and our concentrate feeders. Sheep tend to be pretty intermediate. They prefer forbs. And cattle are going to be our roughage feeders or grass selectors. So the percentage of the diet that they are going to choose when put into a pasture that has equal amounts of grass, forbs, and browse really is going to be dependent on what type of selector they are. So our goats are going to choose more browse in their diet, so they're going to be selecting or utilizing shrubs more. Our sheep are going to be intermediate, so they're going to select our browse, forbs, and grasses equally. However, our cattle are going to select primarily grass. So this becomes important when we look at diet selectivity in terms of pasture makeup. So each pasture, each piece of rangeland is going to have one of three plant types on it. And I think we've drilled this into your head pretty frequently with the plant portion. So we're going to have grasses, both annual and perennials. We're going to have forbs, which is our broadleaf flowering plants, and we're going to have browse or shrubs. And so between those three plant types, if we were to put in cattle and sheep into one piece of rangeland that was primarily grass species or had grass species in it, we can see that our pasture composition is going to be primarily grass, a few forbs, and very minimal browse plants or shrubs. Cattle, because they are grazing grass selectors, they're going to select primarily grasses, and then browse, and then forbs. So their diet is going to represent pretty closely to what the pasture makeup is. Sheep are going to probably select more grasses just because that's that's the makeup of the pastures, but they're also going to select forbs and browse to a greater extent than cattle do. So this again relates back to sheep being our intermediate grazers. They're going to select whatever is available. And if grass is the primary type of forage available in a pasture, then they're going to select grass to a greater extent. So when we look at the similarity between the pasture makeup and the cattle diet, those are actually 94% similar. It decreases a little bit between pasture and sheep to 83%, but still, because the grasses are more frequent in the pasture, sheep are going to eat a greater percentage of grass. Now, if we change that pasture to so that it has more shrubs than grasses, then our biodiversity is going to be primarily in shrubs, then grasses in blue, and then forbs in gray. So if we put the same group of cattle and goats out in the pastures and let them go through a selection process for a few days and pull fecal samples out to identify what they've actually been eating, we find that our cattle are still going to be selecting primarily grasses, even though the grasses are actually available in a smaller concentration than our shrubs. However, goats, on the other hand, if we swap out our sheep for our goats are browsers, so they're going to utilize primarily shrub materials because we're in a shrubby pasture. So the percentage of similarity between the pasture makeup and the cattle diet is dropped significantly to 69%. However, because we're changing the biodiversity of the pasture to a shrubby pasture, the goats selection as well as the pasture makeup are going to be 80% similar. All right, so this really leads us in and gives us some basis for for grazing multiple species on one piece of rangeland. Usually that happens at two different times because grazing multiple species at the same time can be very, um, what's a good way to put this? Can be a large pain when you have to sort out different species from one another because their herding techniques and the ability for you to sort them is really quite quite different. So in the next series, we're going to get into multi-species grazing.